Hi all, welcome to Physio Exam Buddy. In this quick video, we will cover the basics of endocrine hormones, their classification and how they act on the target cells. A simple, fast revision to build your core understanding. First, about the classification of hormones. Depending upon the chemical nature, hormones are broadly classified into three. The first class, which includes proteins and polypeptides. Second one includes the steroid hormones. And the third one includes the derivatives of amino acid, basically the tyrosine. And under the protein and polypeptide hormones comes the hypothalamic hormones, pituitary hormones, pancreatic hormones, parathyroid hormones, placental hormones like human chorionic gonadotropin as well as human chorionic somatotropin, then calcitonin, GI hormones, renal hormones like erythropoietin as well as renin, and atrial natriuretic peptide or ANP. The second class of steroid hormones includes adrenal cortical hormones, gonadal hormones which is secreted from the ovaries as well as the testes, and again placental hormones including estrogen as well as progesterone. And the last class, which includes the derivatives of the amino acid, mainly tyrosine, which includes thyroid hormones, basically T3 and T4, and adrenal medullary hormones. Next is about the mechanism of action of these hormones. If we study based on these three classification, it will be very easier to remember the mechanism of action. The basic mechanism of action of these hormones is that the hormones, when it is secreted, it will come and bind with specific receptors. And on binding with this receptor, it will produce certain cascade of reactions which will produce the effect in the target cell, mainly by the hormone receptor complex. And the specific receptors, they vary according to the classification of hormones. That is, in the first class of hormones, basically the protein and polypeptide hormones, as well as in case of catecholamines, the location of these specific receptors are basically in or on the cell membrane. Whereas the steroid hormones, these receptors are mainly located in the cytoplasm, and the thyroid hormones, the receptors will be present in the nucleus. And if a hormone acts via the cell membrane receptors, there are three types of cell membrane receptors. First one is ion channel linked receptor, second one is a G protein linked receptor, and the third one is enzyme linked receptor. So basically the proteins, peptides as well as the catecholamines hormones, they will act on the cell membrane type of receptor, either any one of these three receptors which belongs to the category of cell membrane receptor. First, about the ion channel linked receptor. Basically, the neurotransmitters like acetylcholine as well as norepinephrine, they act via the ion channel linked receptor. That is, whenever the hormone combines with the receptor to form a hormone receptor complex, it will produce structural changes in the receptor, and these structural changes in the receptor, it will either open or close the ion channel and allow or stop the passage of ions like sodium, potassium or calcium. Whereas the G protein coupled receptors, this G protein basically it is a heterotrimeric protein, that is it includes three different subunits, that is alpha, beta as well as gamma subunits. Whenever the hormone comes and binds with the receptor, it will produce conformational change in the receptor, and this conformational change will activate certain G proteins, and this activation of the G proteins will produce or induces certain intracellular signals, and this intracellular signals can be either opening or closing of the cell membrane ion channels, or this can be either change in the activity of an enzyme which is present in the cytoplasm, or it can also activate G transcription. So these are the three modes by which the G protein linked receptors act. So this picture mainly explains the mechanism of action of a G protein coupled receptor. So this is a G protein coupled receptor which is usually linked to a G protein which includes heterotrimeric protein which includes alpha, beta as well as gamma subunit, and into this alpha subunit usually a GDP is bind, that is guanosine diphosphate is usually bind to this alpha subunit. So whenever a hormone comes and binds with the receptor, this inactive alpha, beta as well as gamma G protein complex, which is associated with the receptor, is activated, and there occurs an exchange of GTP at the alpha subunit for the GDP. And this process, it causes the alpha subunit, to which usually the GTP is bound, to dissociate from this gamma as well as the beta subunits of the G protein, and they will interact with this membrane bound target proteins. That is, the dissociated alpha portion, it will come and bound with the membrane bound target proteins, usually enzymes, and this binding will initiate the intracellular signals, which is responsible for the effect in the target cells. And these G proteins can be either inhibitory G protein, which is commonly referred to as GI, or it can also be a stimulatory G protein, usually represented as GS, that is S for stimulatory and I for inhibitory G protein. And depending upon the coupling of this hormone receptor, there can be either increase or decrease in the activity of the intracellular enzymes, to which the alpha subunit will come and bound. Next is about the enzyme linked receptor. This enzyme linked receptor, it is basically, it may function directly as an enzyme, or it can be closely associated with the enzymes they activate. And outside the cell membrane, these receptors usually have a hormone binding site, whereas on the inside of the cell membrane, it got a catalytic or enzyme binding site. Usually the hormones will come and bind to this extracellular part of the receptor, and the enzyme which is immediately inside the cell membrane is activated, or occasionally it can also be inactivated, and this activation or inactivation will be responsible for the cell function. And the hormones or the growth factors which acts by these mechanisms include fibroblast growth factor, our growth hormone, hepatocyte growth factor, insulin like growth factor 1, leptin, prolactin, as well as vascular endothelial growth factors. Classical example for the enzyme linked receptor is the leptin receptor. As you can see here in this diagram, this leptin receptor, they exist as a homodimer. Homodimer means it is made up of two identical portions, and when a leptin comes and binds to this extracellular part of the receptor, causing phosphorylation, that is addition of a phosphate group, and activation of intracellular associated Janus kinase 2 or JAK2 protein. That is the enzyme which is usually associated with the leptin receptor. It is the Janus kinase or the JAK2. So whenever the leptin comes and binds with the leptin receptor, these JAK2 proteins undergo phosphorylation, and this JAK2 phosphorylation, it in turn causes phosphorylation of another STAT3. You can see here in this picture, that is signal transducer and activator of the transcription, that is the STAT proteins. And this STAT proteins, once it gets activated, then these STAT proteins will activate the transcription of certain target genes, which will cause the synthesis of certain proteins. And you can also you can see in this diagram, that is JAK2 phosphorylation. They can also activate several other enzyme systems that mediate some of the more rapid effects of the leptin, that is the other enzyme systems such as mitogen activated protein kinases, that is MAPK, as well as phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase, that is PI3K, can also be activated by this JAK2 proteins. Next is about the intracellular hormone receptors, that is the receptors which is present either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. Basically the hormones, that is the adrenal and gonadal steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, retinoid hormones, as well as vitamin D act via the intracellular hormone receptors. And the main peculiarity of this intracellular hormone receptor is that it is basically lipid soluble, and these receptors are mainly located either in the cytoplasm or on the nucleus of the cell. Once the hormones comes and attached with this receptor, which is either located in the cytoplasm or on the nucleus, they will bind with specific regulatory sequences of the DNA, which is also known as the hormone response element. And once this binding happens, it will either activate or repress the transcription of specific genes and formation of the mRNA. So this is the classical example of how the intracellular hormones act. That is basically the lipid soluble hormones, that is lipophilic hormones, will either bind with the receptor either located in the cytoplasm or on the nucleus. So this lipophilic hormone, they will enter the cell through our plasma membrane by diffusion, and some of the hormones may bind with the cytoplasmic receptor and some other can bind with the nuclear receptors. And this hormone receptor complex, it will come and bind with certain hormone receptor a response element, and it can either cause activation or repression of this mRNA, and this will produce the actions in the target cells. Next, a few words about the second messengers, that is the many hormones. It will exert an intracellular effect by stimulating formation of the second messengers which is formed inside the cell. So, the hormone which will first bind to the receptor, it is known as a first messenger, that is this hormone is the first messenger, whereas once the binding of the hormones with the receptor happens, it will produce certain intracellular mediator which will ultimately mediate the cell function, and the substance which is produced by the binding of this hormone plus receptor, that is this intracellular mediator, this is known as the second messenger. And the function of the second messenger is that it will activate the protein kinases. And there are three types of second messengers in short, that is cyclic nucleotides basically include cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP. Then the second type of second class of second messengers include IP3, that is inositol triphosphate and diacylglycerol or DAG. And the third type of second messengers include the calcium calmodulin system. Out of this, these hormones basically act via the cyclic AMP second messenger. That is, whenever a hormone comes and binds with the receptor, it will cause the activation of the enzyme. Here, the enzyme will be adenyl cyclase. And once the adenyl cyclase is activated, it favors the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP. And this will produce the phosphorylation of the certain proteins, and these proteins will be responsible for the cell's response. And basically the hormones which act via cyclic AMP second messenger is ACTH, angiotensin 2, calcitonin, catecholamines, corticotropin releasing hormones, follicle stimulating FSH, glucagon, growth hormone releasing hormone, HCG, LH, parathormone, secretin, somatostatin, thyroid stimulating hormone, as well as the vasopressin. Second type of second messenger, that is a phospholipase C system. That is, once a hormone comes and combined with the receptor, it will activate an enzyme, that is the phospholipase C, which will catalyze the breakdown of the phosphatidyl biphosphate, that is PIP2, into phosphatidyl inositol triphosphate, that is IP3, as well as diacylglycerol. And this IP3, this usually mobilizes the calcium from the mitochondria as well as the endoplasmic reticulum, whereas the DAG, it usually activates the protein kinase C and causes the phosphorylation of the certain proteins, and both this calcium release as well as the phosphorylation of the proteins will produce the cell's response. And the hormones act via by these second messenger is basically angiotensin 2, catecholamines, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, then growth hormone releasing hormone, parathyroid hormone, oxytocin, thyrotropin releasing hormone, as well as the vasopressin, which acts via the V1 receptor. And the last second messenger is by the calcium calmodulin system. That is, whenever the calcium ions combines with this calmodulin protein, the calmodulin will changes its shapes and it will cause either activation or inactivation of certain protein kinases. Basically, activation of this calcium calmodulin dependent protein kinases, it causes via the phosphorylation, and it causes either activation or inhibition of the proteins involved in the cell's response. That is the mechanism by which the calcium calmodulin second messenger system acts. So that is about the classification of the hormones and the mechanism of action of the three classes of the hormones. Thank you.